My name is Alessandra Giannini. I am a climate scientist at the International Research Institute for Climate and Society. About 10 years ago, I conclusively demonstrated that droughts in the Sahel in Africa in the 1970s and 80s had been caused by changes in the oceans, not in land use. To this date, understanding the mechanisms of climate change in Africa is the focus of my research. As you know, projections of climate change in the tropics and in Africa are uncertain, especially in regards to the direction of precipitation change. In this webinar, I will discuss the causes of uncertainties in climate change projections in global climate models such as those used by the IPCC. In this presentation, I will explore terms and concepts drawn from the assessment reports of Working Group 1 of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, to describe uncertainty in model projections of future change. I will mostly draw on this material because the assessment reports represent the synthesis of the state-of-the-art on climate science. Hundreds of scientists worldwide contribute to these assessment reports, which serve as the conventional entry point to anyone interested in current scientific discourse on climate change. The models in use here are global climate models, also known as global coupled ocean-atmosphere models, as opposed to the regional climate models used in dynamical downscaling. About 20 research centers worldwide have been developing global climate models, with some efforts going back to the late 60s. Most notably in the US at NOAA's Geophysical Fluid Dynamics Laboratory, at NASA's Goddard Institute for Space Studies, and at the National Center for Atmospheric Research. More complex models, which include the cycling of various chemical species or dynamic vegetation, are referred to as Earth system models. Global climate models and downscaling are the topic of another presentation. Before I go on to characterize uncertainty, let me start with a brief expression of certainty. In the global mean, it is unequivocal that the Earth is warming and clear that the warming is anthropogenic. How do we know that? One way is to compare observations and model simulations. The black line in these plots is the evolution of observed temperature over the 20th century at global and regional scales. It is enveloped by shading in two colors, which represents the multi-model ensemble spread about the evolution of temperature in two kinds of simulations. In blue is the spread about the evolution simulated when models are forced with natural influences only. Natural influences include variations in the top of the atmosphere insolation or in aerosol concentrations due to volcanic eruptions. In pink is the spread about the evolution simulated when the same models are forced with both natural and anthropogenic influences. The latter include greenhouse gases and aerosols from emissions from industrialization. The black curve is enveloped by the blue shading up until circa 1960, meaning that the trajectory of temperature up until the 60s or so is consistent with the influence of natural processes only. In other words, that one need not invoke anthropogenic influence to explain temperature change up until 1960 or so. Thereafter, blue and pink shadings diverge, and the rapid increase in temperature is enveloped by the pink, not the blue shading. Therefore, it cannot be accounted for unless anthropogenic influences are included. Note that in IPCC jargon, degrees of likelihood have direct quantification in percentages. For example, likely means greater than 66% certainty, very likely greater than 90% certainty. Also note that the width of the shaded envelope is larger for regions than it is for the global mean, meaning that the uncertainty in the magnitude of temperature change grows as we zoom into one region. This slide describes uncertainty in time in regional temperature projections. We add 21st century projections of regional temperature change in the orange envelope to the 20th century evolution discussed in the previous slide. The black line still represents the observed trajectory over the 20th century, and the pink envelope around it, the model spread in simulating such trajectory when both natural and anthropogenic factors are taken into account. How is the uncertainty represented here? It is in the envelope in orange shading and in the width of the vertical bars in light blue, orange, and red at the right of the plots. What are its sources? There are two sources of uncertainty behind this plot. The width of the orange envelope represents the spread among models under the same emission scenario. This spread represents the uncertainty that is due to differences among models. The bars of different color on the right-hand side of each plot represent the uncertainty in projections of regionally average temperature at the end of the 21st century that is due to choice of emission scenario. For example, the red bar indicates the warming under emission scenario A2 during the last decade of the 21st century compared to the baseline 1901-1950 period. This warming could be as low, so to speak, as 4 or high as 8 degrees Celsius for North America. Uncertainty is typically quantified using probability distributions. Bars on the right-hand side of the plots on the previous slide are one-dimensional characterizations of the shift in probability distribution that is projected to occur with climate change. An increase in mean temperature, represented by a shift to the right of the distribution, obviously impacts the tails of the distribution, extreme cold or hot. As the entire distribution shifts towards warmer temperatures, the cold extremes on the left will happen less frequently. The hot extremes on the right, even more so the record hot extremes, will happen more frequently. In addition to what depicted here, the width of the distribution could also change. A wider distribution would indicate an increase in variability. This slide represents the spatial variation in likelihood of precipitation change. The case of precipitation change is trickier because it is not so much the magnitude, but rather the direction of change that is uncertain in IPCC projections. Not how much wetter or drier a region is going to get, but whether it is going to get wetter or drier. With global warming, the water cycle is expected to spin up at global scale, meaning that water will cycle faster between the ocean reservoir, atmosphere, and land. But how that translates into regional changes is not fully understood. What is depicted here is the number of models that project more rain in the future, in green or blue, or less rain, in yellow or pink, at the end of the 21st century compared to conditions simulated at the end of the 20th century. Uncertainty here is represented in the differences in color shading. Green is fewer models agreeing on an increase in precipitation, hence a less certain increase in precipitation than blue. Yellow, a less certain decrease in precipitation than pink. What are its sources? These are projections for the same emission scenario made with different models. Therefore, differences can entirely be attributed to model differences. There are different ways to depict uncertainty, but the underlying reasons are the same: emission scenario, model formulation, natural climate variability. Let's have a closer look at how uncertainty due to emission scenario is typically represented. This figure depicts projections of global mean temperature change during the 21st century. The black line is the observed evolution of global mean temperature during the 20th century, already discussed. The colored lines with shading represent the projected evolution of the multi-model ensemble average under different emission scenarios, contoured by an estimate of the model's variability around it. The bars on the right-hand side represent the best estimates and likely range estimated for each scenario. There are many more examples of these plots in the assessment reports, depicting projections of sea level rise, sea ice extent, precipitation intensity, number of dry days, and so on. Different models can respond differently to the same emission scenario. How does that happen? The emission scenario has to be translated into quantities that are included in model formulation. In this schematic, the emission scenario is first translated into an atmospheric concentration for a certain constituent or pollutant. Then it is passed on to the model's representation of physical processes that are sensitive to the presence of such constituent. For example, the concentration of carbon dioxide is taken into account in the numerical scheme that represents radiation in models. This numerical scheme feeds into the energy equation that determines the climatic response, in this case, the evolution of temperature. The numerical representations of many of these physical processes, which are called parameterizations, are based on empirical or observed relations. They can vary among models. Therefore, the climate response to the same forcing can vary from model to model, giving rise to uncertainty. One should note that the IPCC models do not span all possible sensitivities and outcomes. Rather, each modeling group's effort is in building the best possible depiction of the climate system. What I mean here is that the spread among models does not necessarily span the space of all possible outcomes, rather is a concerted effort at estimating the most likely outcome. Delving into a bit more detail, this plot represents the uncertainty in the response of components of the water vapor feedback, an important contributor to greenhouse gas warming that is due to differences in models. The different components of the feedback, water vapor, clouds, surface albedo, and lapse rates, in isolation and in combination, are along the x-axis. Each symbol in a color type group along the y-axis represents one model considered in a given synthesis study, referenced in the bottom left corner. The vertical scatter for each component of the feedback therefore represents the intermodal scatter due to differences in each model's representation of the same process. By and large, it can be noted that while models agree on the direction of change in the quantity depicted, the magnitudes of the response vary significantly, potentially giving rise to different climate sensitivities. A third source of uncertainty is especially relevant when interested in adapting to climate change in the near future, let's say the next 10 to 30 years, and that is internal variability, or variability that is inherent to the climate system. This can be ascribed to large-scale phenomena such as the El Niño Southern Oscillation or the Atlantic Multidecadal Oscillation, and can confound the response expected from anthropogenic influence, either masking or enhancing it. Consideration of natural variability is particularly relevant when considering regional climate projections, as is manifest in comparing the two plots on this slide. On the left-hand side is how the three sources of uncertainty play out in the case of global mean temperature. At the end of the 21st century, internal variability in orange is dwarfed by model formulation in blue and emission scenario in green. However, on the regional scale, on the right-hand side is depicted the case of Southeast Asia, and at short lead time, it is clear that internal variability in orange contributes the largest fraction to uncertainty. Let's consider the case of precipitation change in eastern equatorial Africa in greater detail. Compared to global tropical land regions on slide 6 of this presentation, there is actually remarkably little uncertainty in end-of-21st century model projections for this region. The top row displays the multi-model average percentage change in precipitation. Note the strong positive signal in green, especially in the center top panel. Since this is the multi-model average response, it is entirely possible that one model projecting a very wet future swamps all other models, which may be projecting modest drying or no change. For this reason, in these kinds of plots, one should also consider the number of models that project wetter future conditions, depicted in the bottom row. In the case of eastern equatorial Africa, the projections for a positive change in precipitation, that is, weather conditions, is a robust consensus of about 2/3 of the models contributed to this assessment. I can interpret this to say that the uncertainty is relatively low, that is, the model consensus is higher in this region than elsewhere on the continent, with the exception of its subtropical extremities, that it could get wetter by the end of the 21st century. Yet, the Greater Horn of Africa has been in the grip of persistent drought for the past decade, as is highlighted in the brown shading in the left plots, and in the downward trend in precipitation anomalies in the right plots. Anomalies have been consistently negative, meaning below normal precipitation with respect to the long-term average since the turn of the 21st century. The current persistence of drought in the Greater Horn of Africa can be explained by anthropogenic warming of the Indian Ocean. If so, then long-term projections for a wetter Greater Horn are at odds with projections for continued warming of the oceans. Pacific decadal variability that is masking the projected trend. If so, drying could reverse in the near term. Or by model uncertainty in the way influences are balanced. For example, remote oceanic influences versus local land surface influences. So how does one reconcile current observed trend and future projected trend? Does one need to understand the physical processes that explain such trends? This is the role of targeted climate research at the IRI.
Hello, I'm Erica Allis, and I'm a Senior Staff Associate at the International Research Institute for Climate and Society at Columbia University in New York. In my presentation, I'm going to summarize the sources of uncertainty in IPCC projections and provide the framing for why uncertainty matters. I will then offer a few suggestions on what you can do given this uncertainty. The first source of uncertainty comes from the emission scenarios. In order to develop climate change projections, we need to make assumptions about future greenhouse gas emissions. These assumptions essentially summarize what we expect the world to be like in the next 50 to 100 years, and take into account variables such as energy sources, global population, deforestation rates, and so on. These assumptions are complex, and uncertainties arise from this complexity. The second source of uncertainty is model formulation. This figure depicts the Earth's climate system. GCMs simulate the evolution of the Earth's climate system over time, taking into account all or a subset of the interactions shown here. Model results differ because GCMs vary in the treatment of these various factors. For more information on this, I encourage you to check out the GCM webinar. The third source of uncertainty is natural climate variability. This variability can be ascribed to spatially coherent, large-scale phenomena such as the Atlantic Multi-Decadal Oscillation, or AMO, or El Niño Southern Oscillation, or ENSO. This internal variability can confound the response expected from anthropogenic influence, either masking or enhancing it. Natural climate variability is particularly relevant if you are interested in the climate change of the next 10 to 30 years, rather than the end of the 21st century. In the following series of slides, I will present a few examples on natural climate variability and the associated effects of these events. ENSO stands for El Niño Southern Oscillation and refers to the coherent and sometimes very strong year-to-year variations in sea surface temperatures and precipitation across the equatorial Pacific Ocean. El Niño and La Niña represent opposite extremes in the ENSO cycle, with El Niño being warmer than average and La Niña being cooler than average, as depicted in this figure. This figure is taken from the IRI-IFRC map room and offers a great example of how we can learn from the past. In this map room, we are comparing historical ENSO events with historical rainfall anomalies to highlight typically encountered effects in an El Niño. The green areas depict above normal rainfall, and the yellow regions depict drier than normal conditions. Let me offer a few concrete examples. El Niño drought conditions in Indonesia elevate the risk of uncontrolled spread of peatland fires, which can add vast amounts of greenhouse gas emissions to the atmosphere and also adversely impact human health. Another example, in southern Africa, El Niño-induced droughts can cause crop failures and food insecurities. This is the same map room, only this time depicting the climate effects that commonly accompany La Niña. Again, the green areas depict above normal rainfall conditions, and yellow regions depict drier than normal conditions. And a couple of concrete examples. In Bangladesh, 4 out of the 6 most catastrophic flood events that have occurred since 1954 occurred during La Niña cycles. La Niña is also associated with increased hurricane activity in the Atlantic and can cause the path of typhoons in the western Pacific to shift more towards mainland Asia. This slide addresses some of the common effects of the Atlantic Multi-Decadal Oscillation, or AMO for short. AMO is an ongoing series of long-duration changes in the sea surface temperatures of the North Atlantic Ocean. AMO affects air temperatures and rainfall over much of the Northern Hemisphere, in particular North America and Europe. It is associated with changes in the frequency of North American droughts and is reflected in the frequency of severe Atlantic hurricanes. It alternatively obscures and exaggerates the global increase in temperatures due to anthropogenic climate change. In the bottom left figure, the red lines indicate the increase in the number of hurricanes in the Caribbean as a result of warm phases in the AMO. Since the mid-1990s, the AMO has been in a warming phase. So why does uncertainty matter? Development practitioners need to make adaptation decisions at the regional and more preferably at the local level. If you recall from Allis' presentation, IPCC uncertainty is greater at the regional level. And if you wanted to try to downscale this to the local level, well, let's just say at best, the level of uncertainty would be the same, and it's more likely that it would be greater at the local level. In the East Equatorial Africa example Ali presented, there's robust consensus from about 2/3 of the IPCC models that this region will get wetter. However, the Greater Horn of Africa has been in the grip of a persistent drought for the past decade. So why this contradiction? What should you be adapting to in this case? After all, you don't want to spend your funds adapting to the wrong future. Another important factor to consider when thinking about uncertainty is the timescale of your decisions. Development and adaptation practitioners frequently make decisions for the coming months and years, and less frequently for activities spanning the next 50 to 100 years. So what can you do with all this uncertainty? Well, there's growing evidence that adapting to climate variability can enhance resilience to long-term climate change. Climate services are a critical component to these adaptation activities. Examples of climate information products are tailored seasonal forecasts, decision support tools for reservoir management, early warning tools for disaster, health, and food security, and these could be explored in your portfolio of activities. You can also learn from the past and stay informed on current trends. It's unequivocal that the Earth is warming, and the increase in mean temperature will correspond to record hot extremes happening more frequently. Therefore, you can evaluate what adaptation activities have worked in the past and how these might be scaled in the future. And finally, adopt no-regrets interventions that reduce vulnerability and support sustainable development. For example, if your activities are located in a vulnerable coastal area, integrated coastal zone management, disaster preparedness, and early warning tools would be good entry points to explore. And as always, concerted efforts should be made to link mitigation activities with those of adaptation. This concludes this webinar. Thanks so much for participating in our webinar series. I hope you now have a better understanding of how climate information can be integrated into your activities. Again, thanks so much for listening.